Hello, and good morning. Today I wanted to cover a topic that seems to come up pretty much all the dang time, which is just basically how do you actually get the series? What's even out there? Simply because, let's just say that their schedule of releases and where they put everything is an absolute clustercluck. So, due to that fact, there's actually, in many cases, very few options in terms of actually getting some of these games the proper ways, so you may have to get a little bit creative. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started with this. So right off the bat, we have the original Ogre Battles here. So as far as March of the Black Queen, there's actually 3 official versions that are out there. You have the SNES original, just complete original. If you've never played any of the Ogre Battle series, essentially they are kind of like a hybrid real-time strategy, turn-based kind of thing. Where you're going around and you, functionally speaking, in terms of actual difficulty, it's relatively easy to quote-unquote just win the war. But the entire Ogre Battle series is more about being able to win that war without ruining the entire countryside in the process, without, basically ruining relations with everybody in the process. So, for example, if you take over the other capital and you end up hopefully only taking the cities that you need to, and you don't end up taxing everybody too terribly long, you don't end up making the fight last terribly long, you send the right people out to the right places, like say there's a bunch, there's basically a complete ghetto and whatever else, and it's like, okay, send all your low alignment units over there, or you've got this place over here that's all religious and everything, so you send all your paladins down there, like, it's that kind of thing. So you're basically trying to keep up relations while essentially running this more or less supernatural, crazy, god war, more or less. And yeah, it's really fun. Like if you've never tried it, it's an absolute blast. It holds up ridiculously well. I never even tried it up until last year, and yeah, it holds up fantastically. I've played I played 2 of the 3 versions. Unfortunately, the third one, while I can technically get it to emulate, I can't figure out for the life of me what the hell's going on because it's only in Japanese. So you've got your SNES original, you've got your PS1 version, which not many people realize is actually drastically different from the SNES one. On paper, it seems like it's just visual. Actually, you can see in the pictures here, on the left and the right, if you compare the same things, more or less. So, for example, the PS1 version will have a camera that's moving around. It has, quite frankly, largely different visuals. Interesting note, by the way, these visuals are the ones that are later used as statues in the PSP remake. But we'll get to that later. So, it's got very different visuals. It's actually got very different balance as well. So, for example, in the SNES version, you've got all your cards that you essentially use to call out different abilities during a battle and all that. You could use those infinitely, like you could just keep spamming the button and you could go through your entire deck of cards in one go. So in the PS1 version, you can only use 1 card per each of your characters. On top of that, really overpowered classes like the Princess ended up getting nerfed. So for example, she doesn't seem to have her leadership bonus anymore. Some of the more oppressive ones, like cockatrices, seem to have their abilities reduced pretty drastically as well. So for the sake of comparison, say you have a Griffin and it's in the back row, it does a wind attack, it does maybe 20 to everybody in the opposite team. A Cockatrice would instead have a roughly, it feels like about 15-20% chance to essentially do twice as much damage to one guy and petrify them, knocking them completely out of the fight. But they seem to be faster. I could be wrong on this, but they seem to always act first. So there's a chance for them to completely disable a unit right off the bat, but they've only got a 20% chance to work. Personally, I really like them. I've been told by a few folks that they're kind of worthless. I use them. Like, I use 3 in my party, for example, that I've been doing on my last run. So that's different. It feels like some of the formations are different as well. Like, right now I'm on the, what's his face? The blue Diva guy. Levian or something, I want to say? Levion? Something like that. And I could be wrong on this, but I believe he had Terror Knights in the original, and then he comes in with Master Samurai in the PS1 version. If I'm wrong on that, please correct me, but I have noticed a few cases where it feels like they're coming in with different formations. On top of that, there's the option to save anywhere. Just in general, everything looks nicer. They added what I guess it's questionable if it's really a feature, but essentially the music just goes completely mute if you pause the game. So at least I guess you know when it's paused. On top of that, there seems to be an extra speed option, as as in before, if you put everything up to 3, it would be the equivalent of 2 in the PS1 version, so everything just seems to run faster. There doesn't seem to be as much of a control delay, although you do occasionally run into that on some lower performing devices I've found, especially if you're running it on maximum speed. I've heard some complaints about the the fact that it comes up with a little loading thing during a lot of the battles. I will note, comparing the two side by side, it was not that significant of a time difference. Personally, like I said, going through both of them, playing them side by side, I really cannot say that it was any significant difference between the two time-wise. Loading into battles is a little bit it's like a second longer. It's nothing. I should mention the overworld map. Like when you're starting the map for the first time, it's about a second or two longer. For the battles themselves, it's like a fraction of a second. Playing it on a Vita, I've noticed it just blips the now loading thing for a second and then it comes back. It's more or less identical speed-wise to the SNES version, and again, it has less of that what I would call SNES jank, where it's just suddenly everything freezes up for a second and then goes back to working. Actually, OB64 had that as well, but I've noticed a lot less of that. And yeah, you can run this on dang near anything. As you see, I have all the different devices you can run it on here. Actually, there's technically 2 other versions I should talk about as well. So you've got Prince of Zenobia. It's a kind of side story, Tristan's side story, if you've played through the game before. Just kind of explaining what he was doing up to the point where he wound up in the slums. It's all in Japanese, though. So, it seems like they added some cool stuff, more cutscenes and all that kind of thing, but it plays exactly the same as far as I've been told. It's the same thing, it just doesn't look as good. But at any rate, unfortunately, it doesn't look like it's ever going to get a translation. The thing's on a friggin' Neo Geo or some crap. So, yeah, that translation's unlikely and probably not worth anyone's effort, to be completely honest. I'm hoping... I know a few people that speak Japanese. I've been kind of hoping that one of them will take up the project and maybe do at least a playthrough of it, so at least we know what's going on. But either way. And then the last version is Ogre Battle Hard Type. It's not listed. It's not listed here, but it's kind of the big mod, also known as Ogre Battle in the Lap of the Gods, for the sake of that necessary Queen reference. But yeah, so that mod is pretty darn fantastic. It kind of goes more, I would say more of an OB64 route if you've played that game before, wherein it tries to make it to where it's a lot more punishing if you lose a unit. So, for example, you can't just send everybody out in a massive, suicide mob, more or less, and then just, you eventually just overwhelm the capital, and then you just get everybody back. So, instead, it's 20 grand to get anybody back on their feet, but you technically don't have deployment costs, but you also have the option to, buy equipment for them earlier on. It's an interesting mod. There's a lot of different classes and all that kind of thing. By the way, one thing I should clarify, because I saw this come up a couple times, just in terms of the general balance of the game. One thing that Hard Type adds is another tier to the Valkyrie tree. I've heard it mentioned a few times that the Valkyrie is the only female hybrid caster or whatever. There's the Muse. I don't know why that gets forgotten. I've seen 4 times now where it's been mentioned yeah, they can be these 3 classes and then a princess and that's it. No, the Muse is really good actually. So it's basically an upgraded Valkyrie that it's exactly like OB64. They can do their big AoE in the background. They can be pretty competent in the front. But yeah, very useful units. Especially considering how prevalent they are later in the game, I'm a little bit surprised that doesn't come up. And then the last change I should probably mention, since I don't want to get too much into that mod there. That's really one of those you gotta kind of play for yourself to appreciate. But the last thing I should mention is with a lot of the visuals, when I was saying that they were referenced later on in the PSP remake, essentially you have things like a lot of the sprites being westernized. There was kind of the big Christianity craze going on at the time. For example, all the priests, instead of carrying around ankhs, they now have croziers. Instead of the berserkers have a slightly different look. Just in general, there's little slight tweaks all over the place, and the nice thing is with your unique characters, you'll notice all of your uniques actually have a proper unique sprite to them. But not just that, if you end up changing them, they'll actually retain that same color palette, which I'm surprised that they didn't bring back in other games. Even in OB64, they actually didn't have that feature. Even in the PSP remake, they never had that feature because yeah, they will just recolor their entire armor and their entire setup in order to keep with their theme. So, like for example, with Lance, he's basically a slightly he's got like some slight gilding on all his stuff and everything else, and he's a slightly shinier paladin if you upgrade him to that. Or with like Ash, for example, he's got more of an orange tint to all of his armor, and then if you switch him to something else, he will retain that orange tint. And it's interesting because, yeah, each of them will react differently to each class, so even just messing around with the different classes that way was really nice. I always appreciate the little stuff like that, so either way. So that more or less covers March of the Black Queen. So moving on to the next one in the series, since they kind of assumed it would fail. Yes, that is legit, by the way. They actually assumed that March of the Black Queen would fail horribly. And so, yeah, they they ultimately Tactics Ogre happened because they thought it was horrible. And then it turns out they're like, wait, crap, we made 2 really good games, actually. so yeah, who knows? Maybe that's part of the reason that it's led to future series confusion. Anyway, so, first off, why am I mentioning Chronicle Valeria on the right? It's, for whatever reason, the mod does not seem to run on some of the consoles mentioned. I'll get to more on that in a moment. So, TO, first kind of strategy game of its type, more or less. I mean, you did have Fire Emblem, but you didn't have this. Like, you didn't have this sort of FFT-esque thing up to that point. Granted, I know there's similarities with other things. I'm not getting into that. I'm just saying, it's this. So if you want to play this, it's functional on all of the standard emulators. The little laptop on the left, it's just there to represent like your computers, your phones, your specialized emulation consoles and all that. It's just there's so many of them out there that yeah, I'm going to include a description or rather links to a lot of these things in this video just for the sake of anyone that wants to get them. Actually, before moving on to this one, I should mention these two right here. So your Wii and your Wii U, this is up until January 29th, so you have about a month. So if you have either of these consoles and you want to get that game, go and get them now, because the virtual store will be closing down on those in a month. We'll be getting more on that later, because OB64 is the exact same thing. Now then, moving on to TO. So you've got your original version, pretty darn fantastic on the SNES. The PS1 version, I would argue, is largely more stable. They're identical content-wise. I believe there's some slight musical differences, like they did mess up the music a little bit on the PS1 version, but I will say, personally, I prefer the stability of the PS1 version. I haven't seen any, save corruption bugs or any of that. And on a 100-hour-plus game, you do not want save corruption bugs. So I will say that much. If you know Japanese and you want to see, like, the sheer breadth of stuff that can be done with this game, go try out Chronicle Valeria. God, that mod is huge. Like, it's ridiculous how much stuff is in there. They basically took all the mechanics from all the series and even then added more stuff, and then added like all the recruitables from all games and everything, and added new ways to recruit them, like a full day-night cycle and like a full like alignment and fame system for each and every single unit, full promotion trees. Like, it's insane how much stuff is in there, but I don't understand any of it because I don't speak Nintendo. I'm sorry, I don't know the language. I don't know Japanese, so man, if somebody can do like a full in-depth thing of that, I think there's only one guy that tried so far, and that ended about 4 videos in, so man, it's so good. But anyway, the original is an absolute masterpiece as well. It's a wonder how this was their first attempt at the setting, because yeah, you've got branching storylines, you've got like permadeath on characters, you've got all kinds of different features, all kinds of different promotions and stuff like that for each of your units, and all of them function differently. You got all your different side stories and everything else going on, all of your timed events and everything. There's just so much to it, and it's the unique thing it brings to the table strategy-wise is that yeah, you can give any unit any item, with some very small exceptions. Yeah, you can just like give anybody anything. I mean, you want to have a bunch of wizard archers, you can do that. If you want to. I mean, granted, by the end of the game, you'd probably want to optimize stuff a little bit, but you can do anything you want, really. I mean, you want to have a bunch of fairies running around with halberds, whatever, go for it. It's pretty fantastic. Pretty darn fantastic, and it added a training mode that's really fun to mess around with. Like, if there's any strategy game where you're like, man, I wonder if this unit could beat this other unit with all of their crazy skills. And yeah, you can just do that. You just can get any of your units to just train against each other all the time. The balance, like, it was very level orientated. So if you get a few levels behind, you want to just set them to auto train in that training mode. But either way, absolutely amazing game. Cannot recommend it enough. So yeah, you can play that on all standard emulation stuff on a PSP. If you have a custom firmware PSP, on a SNES Classic, which I'm assuming enough people got that thing that they probably want to jailbreak it. I assume this was a common enough thing. I personally love the SNES Classic just because, yeah, there's so much stuff you can run on it. The Vita, simply because it's emulating the PSP, and then it was on the PS1 as well. Again, since it was on the SNES, I'm assuming the SNES Classic will wrap that in there nicely as well. So that's everything you can run on that. Now, OB64, this is going to be the odd duck of the family. Thing is, emulation for the N64 sucks globally. Like, it just doesn't want to work on anything. So if you've got an original N64 and you've got excessive amounts of cash, you can go get it. You can go get the original cartridge. So there's that. However, again, for the sole limited time thing, up until January 29th, on the Wii and the Wii U, you can pick up OB64. It's $10, give or take. At least last I've heard it was $10. I see no reason why it would have changed. So again, if you have either of those consoles, or if you were thinking about getting one for your collection or for whatever else, you can get it. That's the only legit way to get this thing. Like, as far as legitness goes, I should mention on TO, there's no legit way in the States. Like, if you're overseas and you have a Wii, I believe you can pick this up. But in the States, there's no legit way, aside from buying a copy of the original disc off eBay, or just friggin' emulating it, to actually get that game. For OB64, you've got the Wii, you've got the Wii U, you've got your usual eBay things, and then if you're emulating, it's a weird story. So, Project 64 is the one to use if you want to use it on basically anything. As far as the different emulators go, Project 64 is the most consistent. You're still going to get visual bugs, but at least it's good, it functions, everything runs right, you just deal with the occasional weird jittery screens and all that. So, PSP and Vita. They've got something called Daedalus 64. And quite frankly, here's the thing, it technically runs if you're okay with all of your characters being weird shadow people. Yeah, it's exactly as weird as it sounds. Like, it functions, it works. You just can't put it in shutdown mode, or you can't put it in standby, and all of your characters are shadow people. Other than that, it seems to run. Wouldn't recommend playing that way, but hey, I mean, if there's no other way for you to access it somehow, there you go. It's an option, technically. And then on the SNES Classic, interestingly, I think there is a way to get it running stably. After testing for a good chunk of yesterday and part of today, what I've been able to see is that, yeah, it can run. Like, it runs perfectly. However, between some transition screens, like, for example, the scene transition screen, you have to mash start to skip it because the end of that screen inexplicably crashes the game for some reason. And there's also just some weird visual jank when loading certain scenes, so the screen just turns green, because who knows why. And on top of that, it appears like the system just runs out of memory or something. Depending on the different settings, I've tried twiddling around with all kinds of different stuff, but I've been able to get it to run for at least 10 minutes normally. So I think with some tweakings, it may be possible to get it running consistently, and maybe for a more extensive period of time. Again, there's a lot of settings to mess with. The one that I was testing that had the most success was Gloopin 64, so if you have that set up on your SNES Classic, there you go. So I will make an update if I find any better way of doing that, but that's just so you know, that's kind of out there. And again, if you have a Wii or Wii U, or you were thinking about getting one for any reason, do so. I will include links to the cheapest ones I can find off of Amazon or something. And yes, they will be affiliate links. I know, I'm trying to make a penny too. But, point being, they will be there. So, like, you literally have a month on that. They've said that they're bringing some of the older games over onto the Switch at some point. They have not confirmed anything for this game, so I don't know for sure. I mean, hopefully they do. I know personally, like, I might actually consider finding a way to get a Switch if they actually ported them over, but either way. So, next up we have Night of Lodis. This is one that you're only going to be able to emulate. I saw like one copy on eBay for about 80 bucks. I don't think anyone's going to be shelling that out, to be completely frank. Oh, by the way, if you weren't aware, there was actually a recent change in emulation laws that basically said if there was no reasonable way or no official way to obtain an item, emulation for the sake of recreation is perfectly legal. So, I'm sure there's more to it than that, but recently, I want to say like 3 months ago, something like that, that's when the laws came down on that. Or at least the new directions for those laws, so I would expect that to be updated relatively soonish, but just so you know where that stands. Now, again, with Night of Lodis, it's a fantastic game, but it unfortunately got very little official support whatsoever. It only ever came out on the GBA, it never came out on any of the digital stores or anything like that. I've tried writing email after email to them, trying to figure out if there's anything that can be done as far as getting this game re-released at some point. Like, I would love to be able to get it on a 3DS, for example, but unfortunately, none of that is the case. But it does run perfectly on if you have a GBSP. That's something that you can run on a PSP and therefore on a Vita, as well as running it through a SNES Classic and any other emulation things that you might have. It runs perfectly well on phones. I know I personally have played this thing to death on my phone. And even on a complete and utter garbage phone, like one of those ones that's like 25 bucks with the ultra cheap carriers and things like that, it's still emulated pretty darn well. So, you know, very solid, very workable. It's a fantastic game if you've never tried it. I would recommend playing it on fast forward, at least like 1.5 speed, just because, yeah, it was running on GBA, so they had a lot of mechanics to work in there and not a whole lot of hardware to work with. So, yeah, definitely worth trying. I wouldn't expect a re-release of that one anytime soon, especially because Matsuno kinda sorta disowned it. Like, apparently he just kinda got mad about the fact that anybody tried to mess with one of his characters. So, yeah, if you didn't know, the story is more or less the backstory of Tartaros from Let Us Cling Together. And, yeah, he apparently didn't like that it made his backstory better. So he just kinda said no, he doesn't like it. He doesn't think it's part of the series, whatever. So, whatever, more power to him. Why not? Oop, did not mean to do that. Okay, and then last on the list, if it actually decides to... hang on, is this going to work? Bam, there we go. Is Let Us Cling Together, the PSP remake. And if you didn't know, there's actually two official versions of this as well. I assume most people, if they've run into the series at all, have probably seen this game. Like, I'm assuming this is where a lot of people got their start in the series, and yeah, I'm assuming you played the US version because that's the one that had the most content, the one that had the most stuff. It did have some weird balancing issues later in the game, but I will mention, if you ever wanted to revisit it, if you wanted to do any of that, look up the One Vision mod. It's hands down one of the greatest mods I've ever seen. It's a complete overhaul of all the systems to try and make the game more immersive and follow its own story a bit better, and it's fantastic. It's almost at 1.0. Either way, it's just absolutely incredible. Now, if you've ever wondered like why it is that some of the weapons were balanced weird, why it seemed like maybe the Japanese folks were talking about a completely different game, it's because they were. The Japanese version is pretty noticeably different, all things considered. Some of the shop unlocks happen earlier. The AI functions differently, so the AI will use buffs a lot more often, which sounds good, but I'll be honest, it is annoying as hell. That's probably why they took it out in the US version. Also, there's the slight thing that all of their stats go up 10 times faster. Yeah, just a little slight difference there. The base stat growths are 10 times higher. Crafting rates are like 15% lower across the board, though. So, figure that out. Apparently, they just really wanted crafting to fail all the time. Even iron bars seem to have a chance of failing for some reason. I don't know why they did it that way, but either way, I guess that's what they were going for. In many ways, it feels like the game was maybe supposed to have an Iron Man mode and then never did. Because, yeah, that's the only way I can possibly explain the crafting fails. Which, by the way, both versions of this, the Japanese and the US versions, if you ever want to experience it a bit differently, just play through never reloading anything. Just, like, never using any of the chariot, never reloading, any of that. And it actually, I believe, it really drastically improved the game. But either way, that's just personal preference. So yeah, the Japanese version, like I said, the AI is different. You may actually notice a lot of carryovers from the SNES game if you've played it. So for example, the AI will hold formation a bit better. They have a tendency to kind of camp you out a bit better. Like for example, you may have noticed in the US version, this only happens on a couple of the castle fights, where they have a tendency to all hold back and wait for you to approach, but then, you send somebody halfway across the bridge and they're like, screw it, break rank, charge forward, and then it becomes super easy. So yeah, they tend to hold formation a bit better, and they also tend to use height to their advantage a bit more as well. But, all the same old stuff still exists there. Due to the higher base stats, though, you do end up seeing more damage flying around across the board. On top of that, just all weapons were clearly balanced with this in mind, seeing as, in the US version, you ran into eventual situations where you're just dealing with, like, units doing 1 damage all of a sudden. So yeah, the Japanese one, because of those higher stats, you tended to see more damage flying around. Now, if you're looking for picking up this version, this is available on the PSN store. I believe it's down to $15 at this point. I've seen it go down to 10 before. Yeah, it plays perfectly on any emulation that you can think of, really. It takes a bit more resources than I'd like on phones and tablets, but a PSP or Vita will play it very well, and I should note, especially if you're playing it on a Vita, the visual effects are just noticeably improved. So my personal preference is easily on a Vita. It's just, it looks so much nicer. Like, even compared with some of the PC options, it's just, in general, it looks really good out of the box. So that's about that. If you have any questions about any extra stuff in the series, anything else that you want to see covered, anything else that you have a question on, or anything that I can clarify, please do go ahead and ask. There are no dumb questions, because hell, there's very few resources about the series available, just full stop. Now, while I do consider FFT and Vagrant Story to be quote-unquote part of the overall series, I'm not covering them here for obvious reasons, because everybody freaking knows how to get hold of those, and they're easy to get a hold of all over the place. Especially FFT, which has been remade so many times it's nauseating. Anyway, so that's about that. You have a fantastic day, and take care.